The old clock on the wall showed 5:30 a.m. as Margaret quietly pushed her cleaning cart down the empty hallway. The wheels squeaked softly on the polished marble floor of Harmony Music Academy. She had been working here for 3 years now, and every morning started the same way. Clean the practice rooms, dust the pianos, empty the trash, and try to stay invisible. Margaret was 45 years old, but her hands looked older. Years of scrubbing floors and washing dishes had left them rough and weathered. Her gray hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the same faded blue uniform every day. Most people at the academy didn't even know her name. To them, she was just the cleaning lady who came in early and left late. But Margaret had a secret. She loved music more than anything else in the world, every morning. As she cleaned the practice rooms, she would hear the faint sound of yesterday's lessons still echoing in her mind. The academy was filled with the sounds of violins, cellos, and pianos from morning until night. Students came from wealthy families paying thousands of dollars for private lessons with famous teachers. Margaret had never owned an instrument in her life, but she knew every piece of music that floated through these walls. As she wiped down the first piano of the day, Margaret remembered how it all started. 3 years ago, when she first got this job, she thought it would be just another cleaning position. She needed to work desperately. Her small apartment rent was due, and her old job at the restaurant had ended when the place closed down. The academy paid well, and the hours were flexible. She could work early in the morning and late at night when the students weren't around. On her first day, Margaret was cleaning one of the practice rooms when she heard something beautiful. A young student was playing something that made her heart skip. She stopped mopping and just listened. Wow, the music seemed to tell a story without words. When the student finished, Margaret felt tears in her eyes. She had never felt anything like that before. From that day on, Margaret began to pay attention to everything. She learned to move quietly so she could listen longer. She discovered that each practice room had its own personality. Room 3 was where the advanced students practiced. Room 7 was for beginners. Room 12 was her favorite because it had the best acoustics. She could hear every note clearly even from the hallway. Margaret started to recognize the different pieces of music. She didn't know their names at first, but she could tell them. Apart, there was the sad one that made her think of rain, the happy one that sounded like children playing, the dramatic one that reminded her of thunderstorms. She began to understand which students were improving and which ones were struggling. Sometimes, when she was alone in the practice rooms, Margaret would sit at the piano bench. She never touched the keys, but she would place her hands above them and imagine what it would feel like to create those beautiful sounds. She watched the students through the small windows in the doors, studying how they moved their fingers and positioned their hands. The teachers at the academy were impressive people that studied at famous schools and performed in concert halls around the world. Margaret learned their names and their teaching styles. Professor Williams was strict but fair. Ms. Rodriguez was gentle and encouraging. Mr. Chen was demanding but got amazing results from his students. Margaret also noticed the students' families. They drove expensive cars and wore designer clothes. The parents would wait in the lounge area, talking about their children's progress and comparing them to other students. Margaret would clean around them, invisible and ignored, but she heard everything. Some students were naturally gifted. They seemed to play effortlessly, their fingers dancing across the keys like they were born to make music. Others worked incredibly hard, practicing for hours every day to improve just a little bit. Margaret respected both types. She understood that music was different for everyone. But there were also students who took their lessons for granted. They came late, didn't practice, and complained about having to be there. Margaret wanted to tell them how lucky they were, but of course she couldn't. She was just the cleaning lady. During her lunch breaks, Margaret would sit in the small employee break room and eat her homemade sandwich. She could still hear the music from the practice rooms, muffled but present. Sometimes she would close her eyes and try to imagine herself playing. In her mind, she could see her fingers moving across the keys, creating the melodies she heard every day. Margaret's coworkers were nice enough, but they didn't share her fascination with the music. Tom, the maintenance man, was more interested. In sports, Linda, who worked in the office, liked to talk about her grandchildren. They thought Margaret was a bit odd for being so interested in the lessons, but they didn't make fun of her for it. One evening, while cleaning the main concert hall, Margaret found a piece of sheet music on the floor. It had been dropped by one of the students. She picked it up and studied it carefully. The black dots and lines on the paper were like a secret code. She knew they represented the music she heard every day, but she couldn't read them. She carefully placed the sheet music on the piano where the student would find it the next day. That night, Margaret went home to her small apartment and looked up information about reading music on her old computer. She spent hours watching free videos and reading articles about musical notation. It was like learning a new language, but she was determined to understand it. Over the next few months, Margaret began to recognize patterns in the sheet music she occasionally found. She started to connect the dots and lines on the paper with the sounds she heard in the practice rooms. Slowly, very slowly, she began to understand how music was written down. Margaret also started listening to classical music at home. She couldn't afford to buy CDs, but she found free recordings online. She would listen to the same pieces she heard at the academy, comparing different performances and trying to understand what made each one special. The academy had a small library of music books and recordings for students to borrow. Margaret wasn't technically allowed to use it, but she would sometimes sneak in during her lunch break to look at the books. She learned the names of the composers and the pieces she had been hearing. Chopin, Mozart, Beethoven, Bach, each composer had their own style, their own way of expressing emotions through music. Margaret's favorite time of day was late evening. After all the students and teachers had gone home, the academy was quiet then, but the music seemed to linger in the air. She would take her time cleaning, moving slowly through each room and remembering the sounds that had filled the space during the day. Sometimes, very rarely, Margaret would find herself alone in the main concert hall with the beautiful grand piano. She would look at it from a distance, imagining what it would feel like to sit at the bench and place her hands on the keys. The piano seemed to call to her, but she never dared to touch it. She was just the cleaning lady, and that piano was worth more money than she would make in several years. But deep inside, Margaret knew something that nobody else suspected. All those hours of listening, all that time spent studying the students and teachers, all those nights learning about music on her computer, had created something special. She had developed an understanding of music that went beyond just hearing it. She felt it in her bones, in her heart, in her soul. Margaret had no idea that her quiet, invisible life was about to change forever. She didn't know that her years of secret learning would soon be put to the test in the most unexpected way. She simply continued her routine, cleaning the academy by day and dreaming of music by night. Completely unaware that her moment was coming, the invitation came on expensive cream-colored paper with gold lettering. Margaret found it while emptying the trash in the director's office. Annual Harmony Music Academy Gala, an evening of excellence. She stared at the elegant writing. Knowing this was the Academy's biggest fundraising event of the year, wealthy donors, famous musicians, and important people from the city would all gather in the main concert hall she cleaned every day. Margaret had heard about this event for weeks. The staff had been preparing everything to perfection. Fresh flowers were ordered, the grand piano was tuned 3 times, even the doorknobs were polished until they gleamed. She knew she would be working extra hours that night, making sure everything stayed spotless while the guests enjoyed their champagne and fancy dinner. The night of the gala, Margaret arrived 2 hours early. She wore her best uniform, which wasn't saying much, but at least it was freshly pressed. Her job was to stay in the background, quietly cleaning up spills and keeping the restrooms stocked. The academy had hired extra servers for the evening, but they still needed Margaret to handle the less glamorous tasks. As guests began to arrive, Margaret was amazed by what she saw. Women wore sparkling dresses that probably cost more than Margaret made in 6 months. Men walked in wearing perfectly tailored suits and expensive watches. Cars that Margaret had only seen in magazines dropped people off at the front entrance. Everyone looked like they belonged in a movie about rich people. Margaret stayed busy in the background, emptying ashtrays and wiping down surfaces. She tried to be invisible, just like always, but she couldn't help listening to the conversations around her. People talked about their vacation homes, their children's achievements, and how much money they had donated to various charities. It was like entering a completely different world. The evening's program included performances by some of the academies. Best students, followed by a short concert by a famous pianist who had flown in from New York just for this event. Margaret had heard his recordings before and was excited to hear him play in person, even if it was from the kitchen where she would be washing dishes. About an hour into the event, Margaret noticed a group of women gathered near the grand piano. Their laughter was getting louder with each glass of champagne they consumed. At the center of the group was Mrs. Victoria Ashworth, one of the Academy's biggest donors. Margaret knew her by reputation. She gave large amounts of money to the Academy. But she also had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. Mrs. Ashworth was in her 60s, perfectly styled silver hair and jewelry that sparkled under the chandeliers. She had the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about money. Margaret had seen her at the Academy before, usually complaining about something or telling the staff how things should be done better. Tonight, Mrs. Ashworth seemed to be enjoying herself more than usual. She was telling stories about her own piano lessons as a child and how she could have been a professional musician if she had wanted to pursue it. Her friends nodded politely. But Margaret could tell they had heard these stories many times before. As Margaret cleaned a nearby table, she accidentally knocked over an empty glass. It made a small, clinking sound as it rolled across the table. Mrs. Ashworth turned around, noticing Margaret for the first time that evening. "Oh, look," Mrs. Ashworth said loudly, her voice carrying across the room. "It's one of our hard-working staff members." She gestured toward Margaret with her champagne glass, and suddenly several people were looking in their direction. Margaret felt her face turn red. She quickly picked up the glass and mumbled an apology, hoping to disappear back into the crowd. But Mrs. Ashworth wasn't finished. "You know what I was just thinking?" Mrs. Ashworth announced to her group of friends. "We've been talking all evening about the importance of music education, but we're only hearing from the privileged students. What about the regular people? What about the working class?" Her friends looked confused, not sure where this was going. Margaret tried to move away, but Mrs. Ashworth called out to her. "Excuse me, dear," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "What's your name?" "Margaret," she replied quietly, still hoping to escape this uncomfortable situation. "Margaret. What a lovely name. Tell me, Margaret, do you enjoy working here surrounded by all this beautiful music?" Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She could feel dozens of eyes watching this conversation, and she wanted nothing more than to disappear. "I bet you've learned a thing or two just from being around here," Mrs. Ashworth continued. "Maybe you even know how to play a little piano yourself." The question hung in the air like a trap. Margaret could see where this was headed, and her stomach began to twist into knots. She shook her head quickly. "Oh, come now, don't be modest," Mrs. Ashworth said, moving closer to Margaret. "I have an idea that would be absolutely delightful. Since this is a celebration of music for everyone, why don't you play something for us?" The suggestion caused a ripple of murmurs through the nearby crowd. Some people looked curious, others looked uncomfortable, and a few were already pulling out their phones. "I don't play," Margaret said firmly, trying to end this before it went any further. "Nonsense," Mrs. Ashworth exclaimed. "Everyone can play a little something. Even Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star would be charming. It would show that music truly is for everyone, regardless of their background." Margaret's supervisor, Mr. Johnson, appeared at her elbow. He had been watching the situation develop and could see that Margaret was trapped. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said politely, "Margaret has work to finish this evening. Perhaps we should let her get back to it." But Mrs. Ashworth was not to be deterred. The champagne had made her bold, and she was enjoying being the center of attention. "Mr. Johnson, surely Margaret can spare a few minutes for our entertainment? After all, isn't this what tonight is about, bringing music to everyone?" She turned to address the growing crowd around them. "I'll make a generous donation to the Academy's scholarship fund if our dear Margaret here gives us a little performance." The crowd murmured with interest. A generous donation from Mrs. Ashworth could fund several students' lessons for an entire year. Margaret could see the conflict in Mr. Johnson's eyes. He didn't want to put Margaret in this position, but he couldn't afford to refuse such a large potential donation. "How much are we talking about?" asked Dr. Reynolds, the Academy's director, who had just joined the group. "Let's say $50,000, Mrs. Ashworth announced with a dramatic flourish. The crowd gasped. $50,000 was more money than Margaret made in 2 years. It was enough to change lives, to give opportunities to students who couldn't otherwise afford them. Margaret looked around at all the faces staring at her. She saw excitement, curiosity, and yes, cruelty in some of their expressions. They wanted a show, and they didn't care if it came at her expense. "I really don't think this is appropriate," Mr. Johnson said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Oh, it's perfectly appropriate," Mrs. Ashworth replied. "Margaret, dear, you wouldn't want to deprive deserving students of scholarships, would you? All you have to do is sit at that beautiful piano and play us a little tune. What could be simpler?" Margaret felt trapped. If she refused, she would be seen as selfish, someone who cared more about her own embarrassment than helping students. If she agreed, she would likely humiliate herself in front of all these important people. But deep down, in a place she had kept hidden for 3 years, something else stirred. A quiet voice that whispered, "Maybe it's time." "All right," Margaret said quietly. "I'll play something." The crowd erupted in applause and laughter. Mrs. Ashworth clapped her hands together in delight, already imagining the story she would tell. About this evening, Margaret walked slowly toward the grand piano, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. She had no idea that her life was about to change forever. Margaret's legs felt like they were made of lead as she walked toward the grand piano. Each step seemed to take forever, and the sound of her worn shoes on the marble floor echoed through the suddenly quiet room. The beautiful black piano that she had admired from a distance for 3 years now loomed in front of her like a mountain she had to climb behind her. She could hear whispers and giggles. Someone was already recording with their phone. She caught fragments of conversations. This should be interesting. And poor woman doesn't know what she's gotten herself into. I feel bad for her, but it's going to be hilarious. Mrs. Ashworth stood near the piano with a satisfied smile. On her face, like a cat who had just caught a mouse, she was clearly enjoying every moment of this. Her friends clustered around her, her expensive jewelry glittering under the chandeliers as they waited for the show to begin. Margaret reached the piano bench and stood there for a moment, looking down at the keys. They were perfectly white and black, not a smudge or fingerprint on them. She had cleaned this piano hundreds of times, but she had never sat at it before. The bench was made of rich mahogany wood, polished to a shine that reflected the lights above. "Take your time, dear," Mrs. Ashworth called out in a voice that was anything but patient. "We're all waiting." Margaret slowly sat down on the bench. It felt strange, like she was sitting in a place where she didn't belong. She could feel the eyes of over 100 people watching her every move. Some faces showed curiosity, others showed amusement, and a few showed genuine concern for what was about to happen. Dr. Reynolds, the Academy director, looked uncomfortable. He was probably already thinking about how to handle the situation when Margaret inevitably embarrassed herself and everyone else. Mr. Johnson, her supervisor, had moved closer to the piano, ready to step in if things went too badly. Margaret placed her hands on her lap and took a deep breath. Her heart was beating so fast, she thought it might burst out of her chest. She looked out at the crowd and saw all those well-dressed people waiting for her to fail. They wanted entertainment, and they expected to get it at her expense. "Any song will do," Mrs. Ashworth said loudly. Even "Happy Birthday" would be charming. A few people laughed at this suggestion. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment and tried to calm herself. In her mind, she could hear all the music she had listened to over the past 3 years, hundreds of pieces, thousands of hours of beautiful sounds that had filled her heart and soul. She thought about the young student who had first made her cry with his playing. She thought about the late evenings when she cleaned the practice rooms and felt the music still floating in the air. Margaret opened her eyes and looked down at the piano keys. For 3 years, she had imagined what it would feel like to touch them. Now, with everyone watching, she was finally going to find out. She lifted her hands and placed them gently on the keys. The position felt natural, like her hands had been waiting their whole life for this moment. She had watched students do this exact motion thousands of times, and somehow her body knew exactly what to do. The room fell completely silent. Even the servers stopped moving, sensing that something important was about to happen. Margaret could hear her own breathing, could feel the smooth coolness of the keys under her fingertips. Then she began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 filled the room like liquid gold. Margaret's fingers moved across the keys with a grace and precision that seemed impossible. The melody started softly, almost like a whisper. Drawing everyone in the room into its spell, Mrs. Ashworth's smug expression began to change. Her mouth opened slightly as she realized that what she was hearing was not the fumbling of an amateur, but the work of someone who truly understood music. Ah. The giggles and whispers stopped completely. Margaret's hands danced across the keyboard, bringing out every nuance of the complex piece. She played with a passion and understanding that came from somewhere deep inside her soul. This wasn't just someone who had learned to play the notes. This was someone who felt every emotion the composer had put into the music. The piece grew more dramatic, and Margaret's playing became more intense. Her whole body moved with the music, swaying slightly as she navigated the difficult passages. Her eyes were closed now, and she was completely lost in the sound she was creating. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't thinking about cleaning or staying invisible. She was just making music. People in the crowd began to look at each other with amazement. They had come expecting to see a cleaning lady embarrass herself, but instead they were witnessing something extraordinary. Some guests put their phones away, realizing that this moment was too special to reduce to a social media post. The music filled every corner of the concert hall. Margaret's playing had power and tenderness, technical skill and emotional depth. She moved through the challenging sections of the piece as if she had been playing it her entire life. Her rough, work-worn hands created sounds of incredible beauty. Dr. Reynolds stood frozen, unable to believe what he was hearing. He had heard this piece performed by professional pianists, by his best students, by internationally famous musicians, but he had never heard it played with such raw emotion and perfect technique at the same time. As the piece approached its climax, Margaret's playing became even more powerful. Her fingers flew across the keys, creating cascades of sound that seemed to lift everyone in the room. The music told a story of struggle and triumph, of sadness and joy, of a human heart that had found its voice. Mrs. Ashworth's face had gone completely pale. She realized that her attempt to humiliate Margaret had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. Instead of creating a moment of cruel entertainment, she had unleashed something beautiful and profound. Other guests were beginning to have tears in their eyes. The music was so moving, so perfectly played, that it touched something deep inside everyone who heard it. This wasn't just a performance, it was a revelation. Margaret brought the piece to its dramatic conclusion, her hands striking the final chords with perfect timing and power. The last notes hung in the air for a moment, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Then the silence was broken by the sound of applause. But this wasn't polite social applause. This was the kind of thunderous ovation usually reserved for world-class performers. People jumped to their feet, clapping and cheering. Some were crying openly, moved by what they had just witnessed. Margaret opened her eyes and looked out at the crowd. She saw faces filled with amazement, respect, and joy. The same people who had been ready to laugh at her just minutes before were now giving her a standing ovation. She stood up from the piano bench, her legs shaking slightly. She had done it. She had played for them, and somehow, impossibly, it had worked. The music that had lived inside her for so long had finally found its way out. Mrs. Ashworth stood in the crowd, her face a mixture of shock and embarrassment. She had planned to humiliate Margaret, but instead she had given her a stage to show the world what she could do. As the applause continued, Marguerite looked around the room at all the faces. These people saw her differently now. She wasn't just the cleaning lady anymore. She was a musician, an artist, someone who could create beauty with her hands and heart. Margaret smiled for the first time that evening. Her secret was out, and the world would never be the same. The applause seemed to last forever, but eventually it began to fade. Margaret stood beside the piano, still trying to process what had just happened. Her hands were trembling slightly, not from nerves now, but from the rush of finally letting her secret out after 3 long years. As people began to move around and talk again, a small group approached the piano. Margaret recognized Dr. Reynolds and a few of the academy's teachers. But there was also an elderly man she had never seen before. He had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and walked with a slight limp, using a wooden cane for support. "That was absolutely extraordinary," Dr. Reynolds said, his voice filled with amazement. "Margaret, I had no idea you could play like that. Where did you learn?" Before Margaret could answer, the elderly man stepped forward. He looked at her carefully, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle. "Excuse me," he said in a gentle voice, "but there's something about your playing that seems familiar to me. The way you phrase the melody, the way you handle the difficult passages, it reminds me of someone I used to know." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She had been so focused on hiding her identity for so long that she had never considered that someone might recognize her musical style. The old man continued, "My name is Professor Chen. I retired from teaching 5 years ago, but I still come to events like this. I've been teaching piano for over 40 years, and I've heard thousands of students play that particular piece. But your interpretation, your technique, it's remarkably similar to a student I had many years ago." Margaret's mouth went dry. Professor Chen. She remembered that name from her past, though she had never studied with him directly. He was one of the most respected piano teachers in the country, someone who had taught at the finest music schools. "I'm sorry," Margaret said quietly, "but I think you might be mistaken. I've never had formal lessons." Professor Chen studied her face more closely. "What's your full name, dear?" Margaret hesitated. She had been using only her first name for so long that she had almost forgotten she used to be someone else. "Thompson," she said finally. The professor's eyes widened. "Thompson, ... That's not the name I remember. But wait, ... He paused, thinking hard. "There was a young woman, about 25 years ago. She was studying at the conservatory, incredibly talented, one of the most promising students I'd ever heard about. But she disappeared suddenly, dropped out in her final year. Her name was Margaret, but her last name was different. Margaret Chen." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had tried so hard to bury that part of her life, to forget the girl she used to be, but here it was, coming back after all these years. "I think you might be confusing me with someone else," Margaret said, but her voice lacked conviction. Professor Chen's face lit up with recognition. "My goodness, it is you, isn't it, you're Margaret Chen? I remember hearing about you from my colleagues at the conservatory. They said you were destined for greatness, that you could have been one of the finest pianists of your generation. But then you just vanished." Several people had gathered around to listen to this conversation. Margaret felt trapped again, but this time it was different. These people weren't trying to humiliate her. They were trying to understand who she is. Really was. Dr. Reynolds looked confused. "Margaret, is this true? Were you really a student at the conservatory?" Margaret looked around at all the faces watching her. She had kept this secret for 20 years, but now it seemed impossible to hide anymore. Slowly, she nodded. "Yes," she said quietly, "I was Margaret Chen. I studied at the conservatory for 3 years. But what happened?" asked one of the teachers. "Why did you leave? Why are you working as a cleaning lady when you have this incredible talent?" Margaret felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She had never told this story to anyone, had buried it so deep inside herself that sometimes she almost believed it had happened to someone else. "My parents died," she said simply. "Car accident. I was in my final year, about to graduate. I had scholarships. I had opportunities lined up. But when my parents died, I had to take care of my younger brother and sister. They were still in high school, and I was the only family they had left." The group around her fell silent. Margaret continued, her voice getting stronger as she told the story she had kept hidden for so long. I had to drop out of school to work. I took 3 jobs just to pay the rent and keep food on the table. My brother and sister needed me to be stable, to be responsible. I couldn't chase dreams when they needed someone to take care of them. Professor Chen looked heartbroken. But surely there were other options. Scholarships, financial aid? Margaret shook her head. Not enough to support 3 people. And I couldn't ask my siblings to go into foster care while I finished school. They had already lost their parents. I couldn't abandon them too. What happened to them? Dr. Reynolds asked gently. A small smile crossed Margaret's face. They grew up to be wonderful people. My brother's a doctor now, working in Chicago. My sister's a teacher, married with 2 kids. They both did well in school, went to college, built good lives for themselves. And you never went back to music? One of the teachers asked. I couldn't afford a piano, Margaret explained. I worked in restaurants, cleaned offices, did whatever I could to make ends meet. After my brother and sister were grown and didn't need me anymore, I guess I just got used to that life. I told myself that music was something from my past, something I couldn't have anymore. But you kept practicing somehow, Professor Chen observed. No one plays like that without constant work. Margaret looked embarrassed. I never touched a real piano for 20 years. But I listened. I studied videos online when I could afford internet. I read about music theory. When I got this job 3 years ago, I would listen to the students and teachers. I learned just by being around music again. The crowd around her was amazed. The idea that someone could maintain that level of skill without actually playing seemed impossible. That's incredible, Dr. Reynolds said. To keep that talent alive for so long, just through listening and mental practice. Margaret looked down at her hands. I thought I had buried that part of myself forever. I never imagined I would play for anyone again. Professor Chen stepped closer to her. Margaret, what you did tonight was remarkable, but it's not just about your skill. It's about who you are. You sacrificed your dreams to take care of your family. That takes incredible strength and love. But now your brother and sister are grown, Dr. Reynolds added. What's stopping you from coming back to music? Looked around at all the faces watching her. For 20 years, she had defined herself by what she had given up. She was the woman who had sacrificed her dreams, who had chosen responsibility over passion. But tonight, for the first time in decades, she remembered what it felt like to be the girl who had lived and breathed music. I don't know, she said honestly. I guess I never thought it was possible to go back. Professor Chen smiled warmly. My dear, it's never too late to reclaim who you really are. 6 months had passed since that incredible night at the gala, and Margaret's life had changed in ways she never could have imagined. The conversation with Professor Chen and Dr. Reynolds had planted a seed that slowly began to grow into something beautiful. The Monday after the gala, Margaret had expected to return to her normal routine of cleaning and staying invisible. But when she arrived at work, Dr. Reynolds was waiting for her in his office. She thought she might be in trouble for what had happened at the event. Margaret, please sit down, he had said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. We need to talk? Margaret had sat nervously, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for whatever was coming. What happened Saturday night has made me realize that we've been wasting an incredible talent, Dr. Reynolds continued. I want to offer you a position as a piano instructor here at the academy. Margaret had been so shocked she couldn't speak for a full minute. A teaching position? Her? The woman who cleaned the floors was being offered a chance to teach students. I don't have a degree, she had finally managed to say. You have something more valuable than a degree, Dr. Reynolds replied. You have real talent and you understand music in a way that can't be taught in classrooms. Besides, we can work on getting you the formal credentials you need. That conversation had been the beginning of everything. The academy had given Margaret time off to take courses and get certified as a music instructor. Professor Chen had volunteered to mentor her, helping her prepare for her new role. Mrs. Ashworth, surprisingly, had kept her promise about the donation, and had even offered to pay for Margaret's certification courses. Margaret had been terrified at first. After 20 years away from music, she felt like she was learning to walk again. But Professor Chen was patient and encouraging. He helped her work through pieces she had only heard but never played, and slowly her confidence began to return. Her first student had been a 7-year-old girl named Lily, whose parents weren't sure she was ready for lessons. The child was shy and seemed afraid of the piano, but Margaret understood that feeling better than anyone. She knew what it was like to love music but feel like it was out of reach. "Would you like to hear a story about this piano?" Margaret had asked during their first lesson. She told Lily about how pianos were like friends who spoke a special language, and that learning to play was like learning to have conversations with that friend. Lily had listened with wide eyes. By the end of the lesson, she was pressing keys and giggling at the sounds they made. Margaret realized that her years of listening and watching had taught her something valuable about how people learned. Music. Word spread quickly about the academy's new teacher. The parents were curious about the cleaning lady who had become an instructor, and students were drawn to Margaret's gentle, patient teaching style. She understood what it felt like to struggle, to feel like music was impossible to reach. Margaret's teaching method was different from the other instructors. She focused on helping students find their own connection to music rather than just teaching them to play notes correctly. She would tell them stories about the composers, help them imagine what the music was trying to say, and encourage them to play with emotion rather than just technical precision. One of her most challenging students was a teenager named Alex, who had been forced by his parents to take lessons. He slouched on the piano bench and played with obvious reluctance, clearly wanting to be anywhere else. "I hate this stupid piano," he had said during their second lesson. "I understand," Margaret had replied, surprising him. "I hated it too, for a long time, but you're a piano teacher." Margaret had sat down beside him on the bench. "I gave up playing for 20 years because I thought I had to choose between music and taking care of my family. I was angry at the piano for representing something I couldn't have." Alex had looked at her with new interest. "What changed?" "I realized that music wasn't my enemy," Margaret explained. "It was my friend, waiting patiently for me to come back. Maybe we can help you figure out if music wants to be your friend too." That conversation had been the turning point with Alex. He started practicing more and complaining less. 6 months later, he performed in his first recital and his parents cried with pride. As Margaret's reputation as a teacher grew, so did her confidence as a performer. Dr. Reynolds had encouraged her to play at academy events, and she had gradually become comfortable being on stage again. Each performance felt like reclaiming another piece of herself that she had thought was lost forever. The night of her first student recital as a teacher was both nervous and exciting. 12 of her students, ranging in age from 6 to 60, were going to perform pieces they had learned under her guidance. Margaret had spent weeks helping them prepare. She was more nervous for them than she had been for herself at the gala. The recital hall was packed with families, friends, and other academy staff. Margaret looked out at the audience and saw Professor Chen in the front row, smiling encouragingly. Dr. Reynolds was there with his wife, and even some of her former co-workers from her cleaning days had come to support her. One by one, her students performed. Little Lily played a simple piece about raindrops, her face serious with concentration. Alex performed a jazz piece he had arranged himself, adding his own personality to the music. An elderly woman named Betty, who had always wanted to learn piano, played a beautiful rendition of Amazing Grace that brought tears to many eyes. Each performance was different, but they all shared something special, a connection to the music that went beyond just playing the notes correctly. Margaret could hear her own teaching philosophy in their playing, the emphasis on emotion and personal expression that she had learned through her own long journey with music. When all the students had performed, Dr. Reynolds took the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite our teacher, Margaret, to close tonight's recital with a performance of her own." Margaret walked to the piano, feeling a mix of nervousness and excitement. This time, she wasn't being forced to play to entertain cruel people. She was playing for students and families who had become part of her musical family. She had chosen to play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto, No. 2, a piece that told the story of struggle, loss, and ultimately triumph. As she began to play, Margaret thought about her journey from the shy girl who had first fallen in love with music, through the difficult years when she had given it up, to this moment when she had found her way back. The music filled the hall, and Margaret felt complete in a way she hadn't experienced in 20 years. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all the students she would teach, all the people who would discover their own love of music through her guidance. When she finished playing, the applause was thunderous. But more than that, Margaret could see the joy and inspiration on the faces of her students. She had not only found her way back to music, she had found her purpose in helping others discover it too. As people gathered around the piano after the recital, congratulating her and her students, Margaret felt grateful for every part of her journey. The years of sacrifice had taught her compassion. The years of listening had deepened her understanding. And the cruelty of that night at the gala had ultimately led her back to where she belonged. Mrs. Ashworth appeared in the crowd, looking genuinely happy. "Margaret, I owe you an apology for that night," she said. "I was trying to embarrass you, but instead I gave you the push you needed to reclaim your life." Margaret smiled. "Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best outcomes. Thank you for that push." As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Margaret sat alone at the piano for a moment. She thought about the girl she used to be, the woman she had become, and the teacher she was now. Her story wasn't just about hidden talent being discovered. It was about resilience, love, and the power of second chances. Music had waited for her, patient and faithful, through 20 years of silence. And now, together, they would help others find their own voices.